Hello, my name is John Sommers-Flanagan, and welcome. I'm glad that you have tuned in to this short workshop on a strengths-based approach to suicide assessment and treatment. Notice the treatment is in parentheses. That means that we won't focus a lot on treatment. The main emphasis in this approximately 1 hour little educational workshop is on suicide assessment. Today's April 3rd, 2022. And let's get started. Like I said, my name is John Sommers-Flanagan. And in order to prepare for this topic, as you all know, just based on the title, this is an incredibly challenging topic. It's a triggering topic. It's the kind of topic that a lot of people like to avoid because it can be distressing and disturbing. A number of years ago, I was doing a workshop with my wife, Rita, and we were having people answer questions to a survey about having worked with clients who had died by suicide. One person had to walk out and was in distress, and he said later that it was just too emotionally raw for him to think about several young people with whom he had worked who had died by suicide. And so obviously this is a triggering topic. I just like to deal with it directly. I like to just jump in and talk about it. If you need to take a break, do that. I want you to make sure that you engage in some positive self-care as I talk directly about the issue of suicide. It's an important issue to me, partly because about 30 years ago, I had a 16-year-old boy with whom I was working in counseling die by suicide. And it was emotionally devastating to me. And I still sometimes wake up thinking about what I might have done differently. At the time, I knew quite a lot about suicide assessment and treatment, and yet looking back, there are a number of things I still would have done differently. What was most important for me at the time was I had a support group. I had a peer supervision group. That is so important, not to experience this incredibly intense topic by yourself. So not only should we talk about it directly in these kinds of educational workshops, we should talk about it directly with our friends and colleagues and support people. I also have a wife who is a clinical psychologist, and so that was very helpful too, and she helped me gain perspective. And so as we enter into this topic, I want to first just say thank you for being the kind of person who is going to tune in to this topic, to this educational offering, and spend an hour with me talking about suicide assessment and treatment. This is a big ask, and it's a stressful topic. And so thank you very much for being that kind of person who wants to really do the best you can with the students or clients with whom you work. So first, some learning objectives, really two main things. I want to identify the principles of the strengths-based approach to suicide assessment and treatment. Again, not much emphasis on treatment. And this is not designed to be a model that will replace what you're doing already. This is a way of thinking. This is a way of planning. This is a little bit of a way of assessing so that we can make sure that we're not too pathology oriented in the work that we're doing. And the second learning objective is to describe how a strengths-based practice is a little bit different from the traditional approach to suicide assessment and treatment that you have learned. And maybe some of you have even learned about that traditional suicide assessment and treatment approach in my clinical interviewing textbook, which has a chapter that's a little bit more traditional in its focus. Our learning process, we are distant. We are not in the same room, but we can still be engaged. I hope that as I talk about the strengths-based approach, that you can imagine yourself maybe slightly modifying or applying some of the ideas to the work that you're doing with students or clients and in dealing with suicidality. I also hope that this will stimulate some thoughts and ideas in you so that if you feel compelled to comment, you can communicate with me via email or on my blog or one way or another when you see me somewhere, perhaps. I'd love to talk about how this particular approach has affected you. I also hope that you will notice some opportunities to take a deep breath, to cope, and to engage or participate, at least in your mind, as I'm providing you with some skills and strategies and ways of thinking about suicide that's a little more strengths oriented. Quick, a caveat and disclaimer, my youngest daughter is an attorney and I still love her. It's okay. She told me, Dad, you cannot go around doing these suicide workshops and not have a disclaimer. And so this is it. And I hate to get involved in all this legal stuff, but she said I should say the information provided is based on research and clinical experience. And then, of course, as professionals, you're responsible for the application of whatever information I share with you, whatever ideas I share into your work. And you agree not to hold me, the presenter, responsible for any adverse outcomes. That said, I really hope that this presentation will be helpful to you in this very challenging work that we are all doing. We don't often think about strengths when we think about suicide. And so this is my fancy graphic. We're thinking outside the box. This is a little different than how most people think and talk about suicide. And I'm going to go through 7 principles. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. This is the foundation. These are the ways of thinking about suicide that are a little different. The first one, and this may not be terribly different than how you think about it already, is back in 1973, a man named Edwin Schneidman, who is always now referred to as the father of suicidology. He, I don't know that I'd want that name, but he has really made his mark in his writing and research on individuals who are suicidal. In 1973, he wrote the entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And in that entry, he said that suicidal thoughts and behaviors are neither an illness nor a sin. And this is a really important concept. I would bet many of you have heard that the main causal factor leading to suicide or suicidality is, quote, so-called mental illness. I want to say, of course, sometimes that's the case, although I don't like to use the term mental illness for my own personal and professional reasons. I don't think it's useful or helpful. That's my preference. But some of the latest research by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and other suicide researchers suggests that it's more like under 50% of the cases of individuals who have serious attempts or die by suicide who also have a documented mental disorder. And so we cannot assume that suicide is an illness. But even more important is if we do, sometimes that message can get through to the individuals with whom we're working. If we're thinking, uh-oh, this person has a major case of a mental disorder or psychopathology, that can leak out, and then it does not have a positive effect on the individuals with whom we're working. So from the strengths-based perspective, we depathologize suicide disclosures as a natural communication of pain. It's normal, it's natural. When people experience emotional pain, and Schneidman called this psychache, they naturally begin to think of methods or strategies to make the pain go away. And one natural thing to think is to think about suicide. In addition to depathologizing suicide disclosures and viewing them as a natural communication of pain, I really like to tell my students, this is an unmatched opportunity to be of compassionate help. I mean, this is why we got into this business, to help people who are in immense distress work their way through it, come out on the other side healthier and happier and ready to lead more fulfilling lives. So I think it's a really positive opportunity. Maybe I think a little differently, but that's okay. And so the second strengths-based principle is to recognize the limits of those traditional risk and protective factors that we use for assessment. And the reason we need to recognize the limits is because mostly they do not work. There was a study in 2017 of 50 years of research, and they looked at risk factors, warning signs, and protective factors. And in the end, this very prestigious group of researchers, who are way smarter than I am, essentially said, we got nothing. We maybe have a previous attempt that might help guide us toward some kind of improved prediction. But overall, the amount of variance that risk factors and protective factors and warning signs have in individual suicide outcomes is very, very small. And this is one of my really big pet peeves, and so I'm just going to say it really strongly. I just shudder, and I am very upset when I hear the traditional suicide prevention mantra of suicide is 100% predictable. We need to watch for those warning signs. And the reason I really hate that is because if we think that suicide is 100% preventable and that there are warning signs that will tell us who is at risk, if someone dies by suicide, and they will, we will end up feeling incredibly guilty, way more guilty than we already would feel anyway. And so I just want to say unequivocally, if you have had people who you worked with who've died by suicide, if you work with people in the future who die by suicide, those things happen. Those things happen even when individuals have wonderful families, even when individuals have great counselors, even when individuals have fun or interesting or stimulating jobs and friends. Suicide still happens sometimes, and we cannot predict it very well. So since we need to recognize those limits, we instead will collaborate with students or clients to develop individualized safety plans and to decrease the personal distress or psychache, as Schneidman would say, that the individual is experiencing. And that's really kind of our mantra when it comes to working with people who are suicidal. Individualized safety plan, decrease personal distress. We do those two things, we have a chance of engaging in prevention. The third principle is that while we focus on suicide, we need to resist the temptation to over-focus on suicide or to over-focus on everything negative. We need to remember all of the students, all of the clients with whom we work are a vast array of strengths and resources. And we need to focus on those strengths and resources in addition to focusing on the suicide or suicidality. We need to show compassion for the pain. In no way do I want to say that this strengths-based approach is naive. It is certainly not toxic positivity. We want to be alongside the students or the clients in their pain. But we also want, when there is a chance, to pay attention to and draw out the positives, the resources, the strengths, and try to help the individual embrace and use their positive strengths and resources to move forward. The fourth principle, I'm going through them quickly, my apologies, is that we use collaborative and therapeutic assessment strategies or a collaborative and therapeutic assessment philosophy. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But essentially what that means is we start with empathy and compassion and we normalize. We normalize. We balance our questioning. We don't just go with the PHQ-9 or the Columbia or whatever questionnaire we may need to use for both liability purposes and because our agencies want us to. Nothing really wrong with those questionnaires, but if we just use the questionnaires, it only tells us a small little slice of symptoms or negative parts of the individual's experience. So if I'm going to use the Columbia or if I'm going to use the PHQ-9, I might say something like, I need to ask you these questions. They're all worded negatively. I just want you to know it's important information, and that's why I'm asking the questions. But I also want you to know, I want to know way more about you as a person than just these questions. These questions are important, but after I'm done with them, I want to get to know you even more. And then I'll have some positive questions that I'm going to ask the person ready so that I can ask them positively oriented questions instead of just ending on the negative. And of course, I have to say, because I'm an academic, I work at the University of Montana. I have for many years. And this is the kind of thing that academics say. Question number 9 on the PHQ-9 is a mishmash, hugger-mugger blend of passive suicidality and self-harm impulses. It is not even an active suicide question. And so we need to make sure that we evaluate collaboratively the whole person rather than just their suicidality and just use a questionnaire. 5th principle is to implement specific interventions that target the student's distress or the client's distress and suicidality. We need to focus in there. There are many examples of these that exist. We're not going to focus on that a lot in this particular short talk, but there are many examples in my blog, in our suicide assessment and treatment planning, a strengths-based approach book, and other articles that we've written and many other people have written, and many other great books. The next principle is that despite the fact that we are embracing a strengths-based model, that doesn't mean that sometimes, well, I guess sometimes we need to be directive. We need to initiate protective action. We need to be the voice of authority and rational decision-making in the room. That's just true because we're the professionals. We need to take that role. At the same time, we want to be empathic, compassionate, collaborative, to the extent that the student or the student's parents or the client or the patient or with whoever you're working with, to the extent that they can collaborate. We'll talk a bit at the end about what to do or what we start thinking of when our students cannot collaborate with us or will not. And the last strengths-based principle is that we practice excellent self-care. We need to recognize that this is an immensely stressful activity. And if you work in schools, as many of you I'm sure do, or you work in agencies, you're going to see people frequently who are feeling depressed, anxious, and other signs of distress that are also linked to suicidality. And so we need to support each other. We need to acknowledge and talk about our own emotional challenges, our own emotional pain, the ways in which we get triggered. We need to use the skills that we teach. And that's hard because a lot of times in the process of wanting to help other people, we forget to focus on our own needs. And it's really essential, really important. Just a few words about therapeutic assessment and what it is fundamentally. It's a little different than our traditional approach to assessment. If you're a school psychologist or if you're a clinician who does a lot of assessments, you'll recognize that traditionally we are the expert and we do the assessment. And maybe we give someone feedback at the end. Therapeutic assessment was really, it originated in the 1970s, a woman named Constance Fisher, and then later Stephen Finn elaborated on it. But Constance Fisher basically said, we want to collaborate, we want to show compassion, we want to be open, honest, and transparent about the purpose of our assessments. We want to tell people what we're thinking, and then we want to check it collaboratively. And by saying things like, I'm thinking that it sounds like you're having lots of tension in your relationship with your parents. I'm wondering, does that sound right to you? Am I getting that right? Does that fit for your experience? So we want to be collaborative and checking it with the students or the clients. We want to make sure we're giving the message that the student is the ultimate expert on their own experiences, and then go back to collaboration. We need the student, we need the client to tell us about their experiences so that we can actively, effectively, and expertly collaborate with them. One last comment about attitude and principles before I move on to some specific suicide assessment strategies. The first principle of suicide competency always begins with counselor or clinician or psychologist attitude. And we need to make sure that we hold an attitude of acceptance. And one of the things that I like to say is that we want to create an environment that makes it easier for our clients or students to disclose suicide ideation. And you might be wondering why. And of course, it is because we cannot help if we do not know about their suicidality. There was a study that showed that 80% of individuals going through a medical setting did not share their suicidality. We need to ask, and we need to ask skillfully, and we need to ask with an attitude of openness and acceptance. It's important for you to hold the belief or the attitude that you have skills to help people deal with their suicidal ideation. It's important for us to convey confidence, competence, and comfort with this important issue. Some of my first-year students in particular feel very anxious about talking with people about suicide and suicidality. And one of the ways in which I reassure them is to say that suicide ideation is really not a very good predictor of suicide because so many people have suicidal thoughts. Really, as I said before, suicidal ideation is primarily a communication of distress. It's the individual feeling the distress within, and if they tell you about their suicidality, they are communicating their distress to you. It's not a mental illness or deviance, and it's mostly not attention seeking, although there can be situations when it has that feel to it. In terms of our attitude, we need to set aside and bracket all of our moral and our philosophical quirks around suicide, because our goal is to be accepting, to normalize. It is a communication of distress, and then to do an assessment, do a safety plan, work collaboratively and compassionately. So I'm going to go through some assessment skills. I think I don't have these in the right order, so I'm just going to roll on to the next slide. The first assessment skill is called the normalizing frame. We have been told, well, I've been told for many decades, that it's important to ask individuals directly about their suicidality. So to not really, to ask, we can ask about whether they're thinking of hurting themselves, but that's not the same as asking if they're thinking of killing themselves. Now, with very young children, we're going to use different language. We might use hurt yourself if we're talking to an elementary school student who maybe doesn't understand or have much knowledge about suicide or suicidology or suicidality. And so we want to normalize, and we want to do better than just ask directly, or better than just ask, have you been thinking about suicide? That kind of can come out of the blue sometimes for students if they're working with counselors. We want to use a normalizing frame. One example is to say, I've read that up to 50% of teenagers have some thoughts about suicide that trouble them. I'm wondering if that's true for you. That's a normalizing frame. You might say, most people who feel down or depressed or really, really anxious will think about suicide from time to time. Have you had thoughts about suicide? So we're using a normalizing frame first, and then we're asking directly. I hope that you will take some time right now. You could pause this, or at some point in the future, to practice these or similar words. Just like American Idol and The Voice and those judges, they're always saying, You made it your own. You made the song your own. I want you to make the words your own. So you don't need to use these examples I've given, but to somehow give the message to your students or your clients that it's really not terribly unusual for people to think about suicide. And it often happens when people are in distress. And so I'm wondering if you've had some thoughts about suicide. Find your own words. So that was number one. Number two is to evaluate ideation, but to make sure when we do that we also evaluate or we ask about what's happening when you're not thinking about suicide. The traditional thing is to ask about what's happening when you're feeling suicidal, how often, the frequency, how intense, are they really big thoughts that kind of grab your whole brain and body, or are they just sort of in the back of your mind? So try to get a sense of intensity. We ask about duration. How long do they last once they pop into your brain? How long do they go on? So easy to forget this last and probably most important question, and that is, what happens when they go away? Who are you with when they go away? Where are you? What are you doing when they go away? I have a video of myself working with an Alaskan Native woman, 16 or 17. And I ask her the question, and she says, well, I'm singing. And I asked, oh, that's great. Well, what else? I'm writing poetry. And so just by having her tell me what she's doing when she's not thinking about suicide, she has given me some ideas about methods for her that might be effective coping strategies. Singing, poetry, writing poetry, both expressive activities, which I can build on to develop a coping strategy or a safety plan. We want to have, although we'll ask about what triggers the suicide, we want to also ask, well, what triggers the non-suicide? What triggers you feeling better? And I'll get to a strategy that I like to use for that in just a few minutes. Third assessment skill, that one thing. This comes from David Jobs's work. His approach is called the collaborative assessment and management of suicide. It's a very suicide-specific approach. That approach, along with DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, along with brief cognitive behavioral therapy. Craig Bryan is the lead author on that book. And along with a cognitive approach that is also, all four of those approaches have some evidence-based or empirical support for reducing suicide in individuals who are suicidal. The other approach that really has some pretty good evidence is called the safety planning intervention. I'll talk a bit more about that as we, right before we end. Safety planning intervention is a very short-term strategy, and these other ones, the other four that I just mentioned, are longer evidence-based approaches. So Jobs wrote about that one thing that would make it so someone is no longer suicidal. And he uses the question like this: if we could somehow magically change just one thing in your life that would eliminate your risk altogether, what would that be? I love that question. It's a little bit like the miracle question in the solution-oriented model. What I like about the question is it points you and the student toward a treatment focus, right? Because hopefully the person will tell you something that is so disturbing that it pushes them towards suicide. And if it was eliminated and taken away, they wouldn't feel suicidal any longer. Their risk would be gone. It also can reveal some irrational expectations, and I'll give you some examples of that now. Because although it's a great question, it doesn't always, of course, work out perfectly. Sometimes people will give what you might consider irrational responses. And so you might have a student you're working with and you ask that one thing, And the person says, well, my mother would still be alive. Or the person says, I wouldn't have been sexually abused when I was little. Now, you cannot address those. Obviously, you can't make a goal of, in counseling, having the mother come back to life, and you can't have a goal of making the sexual abuse go away. But even the irrational responses to the one thing question are useful because they can point us toward treatment targets, and they can lead us toward treatment strategies. And so if you think about that, my mother would be alive. The issue, I'm sure you're thinking of it right now, is grief, right? So we know that we need to target grief, maybe traumatic grief, but grief. And I wouldn't have been sexually abused as a child. We know the person's telling us trauma. So yeah, we cannot make that sexual abuse go away, but we can provide or refer the individual to an effective trauma treatment. And there are a number of evidence-based trauma treatments out there. All right, that was number 3. We're rolling. Assessment skill number 4. Mood scaling with a suicide or a suicidal floor. Now, this is my favorite 5-minute interview strategy, and maybe it's my favorite 5-minute interview strategy because I made it up. I made it up having worked with probably a few hundred suicidal 16 to 24-year-olds when I was the mental health consultant at Trapper Creek Job Corps. I just learned to use the mental status exam and the mood scaling that happens with a mental status exam in combination with a suicide assessment, and I found it to be amazingly helpful. It begins by asking someone, may I ask some questions about your mood? Don't do that to start a session, but after you have a bit of rapport, usually if you ask that question, may I ask some questions about your mood? Almost everyone says yes, of course. So don't start with that question, but once you have rapport and a little bit of connection, ask that question if you want to do the mood scaling with a suicide floor. I'm now going to click out of the PowerPoints and click into a 3.5-minute video demonstration. So here I am. I'm going to share a different screen because if I embed it into the PowerPoint, sometimes it freezes and does weird things. So we'll see. Let's hope this works. This is me working with a 15-year-old cisgender female girl. She is a volunteer who is channeling these feelings. She is not imminently suicidal when I'm doing this demonstration. We thought it would be too risky to do that. She agreed to channel some of her experiences. And so here we go. Kennedy, 15 years old. The session, as you can see, is about 13 minutes in, and I've decided to do the mood scaling with the suicide floor.
You'll see me do this next. I'm going to ask you a question on a scale. If 0 is you feel so bad, so terrible, that you're just going to kill yourself. 10 is the happiest you could possibly feel. And so you'd be dancing, singing, do whatever you do, doing whatever you do, maybe blasting your music, I don't know. You'd be at a 10, you'd be so happy as you could be. So where are you now on that scale?
5, half.
Half and half. You're about a 5. And what makes you a 5, right?
I mean, coming in here is nice, but I know right when I go back out, nothing's gonna change. So part of me is like, it's okay, everything will be okay. The other part of me is like, nothing's gonna change, everything's still gonna be the same.
Because there's like 2 parts of you. It's all going to be okay is one part, and you're here, so it feels like maybe it'll all be okay. And then there's another part of you that says, that other half of you that says, it's going to be the same old misery at home. Okay. In the last month, what's the worst rating you would give yourself? 0 to 10, same thing. 0 is you're just going to kill yourself. 10 is you're super duper happy.
Probably a 2.
So you've been down to a 2. What's going on? What was going on then?
Just my dad came home drunk, and my mom didn't want to take care of him, so they were screaming at each other like they do. And I was in my room, and I was trying to sleep, but I couldn't. And I had homework, but I just didn't want to do it. So that's, I think, when I came up with the plan about the guns. And I remembered where they were in our house, where all our ammunition is for when we go hunting.
Okay. And then in that same month period, what was the highest rating, best mood you've been in the last month, and what rating would you give?
Probably a 9.
So you've been a 9 in the last month. What was going on then?
We won our volleyball game against our biggest competitor, so it made us feel really good, and our coach was so proud of us. She took us out to dinner, so we had a really fun time, and I was really happy.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm hearing that pattern of what you've been telling me, and that is at home, Dad and Mom are in a terrible screaming fight. You're at a 2. You're thinking about where the guns are and how you might kill yourself. And then you're with your friends and your coach, and you won a volleyball game, and you're up at a 9. And so that seems really consistent with what you've been saying. So now we have to figure out how can we come up with strategies or ways for you to deal with your parents fighting. Here.
Okay, going back to the PowerPoints. All right, so you got to see an example of the mood scaling with a suicide floor. I'm going to go to this next slide because it has essentially the instructions. As you saw with Kennedy, the first thing is to explain the scale, right? That 0 is the worst possible. 0 means so low, so down, so depressed, you're just going to kill yourself. It's the bottom. The 10 is the best possible mood. So we make sure that we've got this best possible mood, best possible kind of non-suicidality, right? So a 10 means that they're just really happy, up, embracing life. And then you have them use that scale, and you start with right now. What are you feeling right now? And what I found that kind of amazes me is everyone answers, and they say, well, I'm feeling a 5 now because this, or I'm feeling a 2 now because this. And of course, sometimes, and the numbers are important, but we shouldn't get too hung up on the numbers, because I have had teenagers tell me, well, I'm a negative 50 right now. And obviously I made my scale, so a negative 50 is not on my scale, but of course I would never correct the person. I just say, well, you're saying you're really, really suicidal right now. And so that's a way for someone to communicate and for us to receive that message. Now you can ask when you go back in time for the worst rating, and go to the worst rating first. We want to end with the best rating because we want to end on a positive. So when you go back to the worst rating, you might say 1 month, like I did with Kennedy. You might say 2 months. You might say the last year. It sort of depends on your sense of what's happening with the individual. And then you ask, well, when were you at the lowest? The person gives you a number, and you say, what was happening then? What we're doing is we're linking mood to a specific experience. What the psychoanalyst would say is we are doing a thing called binding affect. It's always more helpful to bind the affect or the mood or the emotion up or down with life experiences. So we ask about the worst, and again, this is a model. It's a process. If somebody starts to talk with you about a trauma, and you think they need to or want to talk about the trauma, wait. You don't have to jump to, and how about in the last month, what was your best mood? You can linger with the trauma and you can do some assessment around the trauma if it seems like in your clinical judgment, that's the appropriate thing to do. But if, like Kennedy did, she gave me a nice situational description of what triggers suicidality, or a 2, a low mood for her. She tells me it also triggers some planning thoughts in her head. So that's really important information. I don't need to ask a lot more about guns right then in the moment. Instead, I say, well, how about the best in the last month? What would be your best rating? And then I say, what was happening then? And of course, by then, the person usually knows what's happening and they're already thinking about going up the scale and what brings them up the scale. You can see then I immediately shift to some treatment planning with Kennedy, because I know the big trigger is her parents fighting at night and she can hear them, and it makes her feel like she doesn't even have a family. And so that gives us something as a treatment target, a treatment goal. In addition, I know the kinds of social and emotional and team-oriented physical experiences that also bring her up the scale. And so this is a great example of a very quick scaling process. It's kind of a solution-focused process, but we're resonating with the negative for as long as we need to, but we also are identifying what brings the person up. Now, you'll notice I don't have an explicit moment to ask about suicide in this mood scaling process. That's your clinical judgment. Usually when you ask about your low time and the person says, oh, I was down, you might say something like, oftentimes when people are down below their average, they will think about suicide. And I'm wondering if that's the case for you when you were a 2. You also might ask, in the midst of this process, whenever it seems normal, and sometimes it seems a good time to ask this right at the beginning, because somebody will say, oh, I'm only a 4 today. And you'll say, oh, so you're only a 4, what's going on? And then you say, well, you said you're only a 4. It makes me think that you're usually higher than that. So what's your usual average? What's your normal mood rating on a normal day? This gives us a good sense of kind of the range of moods that people can experience. And so I want to discuss this. And so you'll have to do that independently with yourself. You know, you can have a little conversation with yourself. I think it's important to think about what were the thoughts and feelings the mood rating scale brought up for you. What problems did you feel or encounter with it? How might you use it yourself? What are some variations? How is it strengths-based? And so sometimes people will worry that the mood scaling is using numbers, and people hate numbers. And so you don't have to always use numbers. When it comes to how people might use it, I have one former school counseling graduate, and he decided that the students with whom he was working were not into numbers, one of them in particular. And so instead of using numbers on the low end, well, on the high end was pizza. That was the best mood ever. And on the low end was yoga. And so they built together collaboratively a different scale that worked for this 14-year-old. And that was ingenious, in my opinion. Sometimes people will feel like they need to rigidly stick to the process. I hope I've emphasized enough. The process is not, if it feels like you need to linger with something, do that. We don't need to do it in a kind of a lockstep way. And it's strengths-based because we're getting positive information along with what brings people down. I feel like it's a great way in some ways to initiate treatment planning, because we can move straight from there to, okay, I hear some things that bring you up and I hear some things that bring you down. Let's figure out how to increase the number of times you feel up and decrease the number of times you feel down. All that was assessment skill number 4. Number 5 is balanced questioning. And I've kind of already talked about this, but the main emphasis here is don't just ask about depression and risk. Like I said before, if you're given the Columbia, tell them, I'm giving you this really important questionnaire, and I'm going to ask you more questions afterwards because there's much more to you than just these questions. We want to also ask about protective factors and strengths. What has helped before? What are your hopes for today? What are your hopes for tomorrow? When is your sadness gone? When is your anxiety low? We're thinking about distress, and so we want to know when it's gone. But people have their own unique forms of distress. It may not all be sadness and depression. It might be anger. It might be anger that they just can't shake, and it agitates them and contributes to their suicidality. We want to know what helps them concentrate, sleep, eat well. Sometimes with teenagers, they'll tell you smoking pot or some sort of drug use is what helps them. Again, we want to be accepting and just say, okay, so it sounds like that's one thing that you use to help yourself feel better. How about when that's not available? I mean, obviously we can't use pot or drugs. No one can all the time. So what's your second strategy? What are some other things that you might do to help yourself concentrate, sleep, eat well, and just feel better in your life? What brings a little light into the darkness? I had an old supervisor who liked to ask, is it black or is it blue? And of course, she thought that blue was a much better answer. So be sure to map out some positive questions that you can use. Now, as we begin to head toward the end of this video, I hope that you will do some self-evaluation and commit to doing some practice. So think about where do you need to practice with assessment, and how will you get that practice? Do you need help or need to work with normalizing? Maybe you can partner with a colleague or a friend and practice normalizing or exploring the ideation or mood scaling or the one thing question or the balanced questioning. Think about where you need to practice. Are you getting emotionally triggered? That might be something that you can practice again with a friend or a colleague, so you practice through the triggering. One of my favorite stories is with a first-year student whose first client at the university shared being suicidal, and my student was just sort of like overwhelmed, and she couldn't remember all the details of what she was supposed to do. But she did remember she was supposed to normalize. And so she did over and over again, I think 6 or 7 times. She said, it's not that unusual. Sometimes college students do think about suicide and blah, 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 blah. So she said it 5, 6, 7 times. She normalized and normalized and normalized. At the end of the 8 sessions that this client had with our student, the client said to the student, I just appreciated so much how you made me feel so normal. I'd never told anyone about my suicidal thoughts and feelings. And when I told you, it was like, I felt like I wasn't sick or crazy. And you really made it possible for me to talk about that. So how cool. So think about what you need some practice with, and then find someone to practice it with. I also have a much more in-depth process called the Comprehensive Suicide Assessment Interview. I use an acronym RIP-SKIP, or a mnemonic RIP-SKIP, so that I can remember the 6, I know there's 7 letters, but the 6 different things that lead to suicidality or a comprehensive suicide assessment. All right. So in the end, we have to make decisions. We should, first of all, I should have always consult as the number one thing that we do in the end, because no need to be a lone ranger. No need to make the decisions yourselves. partner, you've got a community, you've got a team, you've got the school, you've got colleagues. So find ways to not be alone and to consult about the decision making. And then remember, there's no predictive formula. You need to do your best to collaborate and to use the best practice standards. And there will be guides in whatever agency you're working for. And obviously, you want to try to create that collaborative safety plan. I like Stanley and Brown's safety planning intervention. It is evidence-based and you can get it for free online. Just Google Barbara Stanley, Gregory Brown, safety planning intervention. Any of those probably will get it to you. You can download a PDF and print out a 6-step, or maybe there's just 5, I think maybe 6-step safety plan that they will have you do with your student or client. Now, again, maybe the agency or the school that you work for already has a specific safety plan they like and that they require you to use. That's fine. But take a look at Stanley and Brown's because it is sort of state of the art. It is the one. The other one that has some evidence base is the one that's called the crisis planning, and it's in the book by Craig Bryan, Brief Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Suicide. We want to contact parents or guardians, restrict lethal means, intervene on all the relevant domains or dimensions, and I'll talk about those in just a few minutes, and any idiosyncratic factors that will help our students and clients stay alive. Okay. Again, always consult and then document everything, but not primarily out of self-protection. And one of the reasons I say that is that if we get too oriented toward our liability or our self-protection, sometimes that can leak through to clients as well. One of the reasons that we no longer do safety or suicide contracts, we don't do suicide contracts anymore, and instead we do collaborative safety planning. And the reason is that many clients and many young people started feeling as if the reason that the provider wanted the client or the student to sign a contract, a suicide contract, was to save their own, to make it so. I was going to use a pejorative word. I'm not going to use it because I know how to censor myself. So the clients and students started sensing that it was for liability protection. And so we don't want to give that impression. We want to document everything, but mostly to help us in our treatment effectiveness. And of course, also for liability protection. We want to consider hospitalization. Now, hospitalization, unfortunately, does not have universally positive outcomes. And so David Jobs and many other fantastic, famous suicide researchers will say, you want to maybe avoid hospitalization if you can. But we want to consider it if there's a lethal means and plan in place, if there are previous attempts, and I say attempts because one attempt sometimes actually can be a protective factor. 2 previous attempts sometimes starts to become desensitizing and is really a rehearsal or a suicide rehearsal behavior pattern. If that's the case, that does significantly increase risk. If the person has no alternatives to suicide that he, she, they are interested in, if there's also no interest in or commitment to work on any kind of treatment, not just alternatives to suicide, but treatment, counseling, no interest, no commitment to that. So these are some of the big factors that we use to gauge whether or not we need to call in a county mental health professional to do a formal assessment or to make a hospital referral. Otherwise, and sometimes even when things are very severe in your estimation, Instead of hospitalization, you may want to individualize the risk. In other words, understand the individual risk dimensions that the person's experiencing and target those distressing experiences that they're having, and monitor suicide ideation, and maybe pull the family in to monitor suicidal ideation, and find alternatives to hospitalization, which might include intensive outpatient or day treatment, but treat the whole person and have a very clear safety plan in place. Okay, these are scary decisions to have to make, and there are no perfect decisions, which is another reason why we always consult. So I'm going to do a little summary and conclusions here, and then I have a few extra bonus slides. But the first thing is, what do you want to remember about the strengths-based approach? Just think about what I've talked about. Obviously, you've got this as a video. You can go back and forth if you want to watch some things, although I know for myself, I hate to watch myself, so I would never want to watch this myself again. But you might find a part that you want to watch again to refresh and remember. Think about how you can weave it into your work. So I got some bonus slides. Here's another fancy photo of someone thinking outside of the box or out of the box or something. So one of the things that Rita and I decided is that we want to, in the effort to make a more comprehensive treatment plan for students and clients and patients, is that we decided to try to organize suicide drivers into 7 different life dimensions. This is not like a big rocket science news flash. These are very basic life dimensions, and each one has things within it that can contribute to or drive suicidality. So like in the emotional dimension, the core is people experience psychache or excruciating distress, but they also might experience affect dysregulation, right? There are some other things in the emotional dimension that can push people towards suicidality or make it that they are a higher risk. So for each of these, cognitive or mental dimension, there's mental constriction. People think nothing helps, they're hopeless. Those are cognitive factors that contribute to suicidality. Interpersonal factors, we know from the great work of Thomas Joyner about social disconnection and feeling that you are a perceived burden on others. He calls it thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness. Those 2 factors often can drive suicidality. There are physical and biomedical factors as well: agitation or arousal, being impulsive, or having a high level of impulsivity, illness or physical illness, drug use. These are very physical biomedical factors. Even the new prescription for an SSRI, a serotonin-specific reuptake inhibitor, those can increase agitation and suicidality, usually in 2 to 5% of kids. Spirituality, cultural meaninglessness, or cultural disconnection, those things can contribute to suicidality. There are behavioral factors or dimensions: suicide planning, suicide intent, having a lethal means available. Those are all behavioral dimensions and factors. I recognize some of these overlap. They're not perfect, but these are things to be aware of as we're doing an assessment, a very thorough assessment and treatment planning. And the last of the dimensions is the contextual dimension. And the reason we list that is that there are sociological factors that contribute to suicidality. Some of these are political. There are certainly environmental stressors, environmental toxicities, poverty, racism, oppression, systemic oppression. Those things can contribute to suicidality. And we need to be able to recognize that those are important factors that we talk with our clients about. Give you one taste of an intervention that is based or foundational to the emotional dimension. Oftentimes we know that we want to work with our students' emotional distress, and yet sometimes the distress is so much a part of the person, we need to help them externalize or separate the pain or the problems from the self. This is a narrative intervention, also one that has been written about for several decades in terms of its usefulness in working with people who are suicidal. And so the example I have here, if you look at the cursor, what I do is I draw a gingerbread person. I'm a terrible artist, but I draw this. And then I put all of the distresses on the outside so that the person can get a little visual distance from it. I find this kind of drawing in particular to be useful for teenagers because they kind of see things. Maybe they broke up from a romantic relationship. Maybe they have insomnia. Maybe they've got some physical pain, right? Maybe they think no one will ever love them. And so we want to put some of the solutions on the inside of the gingerbread person. So we have tools, we have tattoo, get a tattoo that goes over the pain, meditate, we have relax, we have choose to listen to a podcast instead of just ruminating around insomnia. So what I'm trying to do with this visual and this intervention is to put the strengths and the skills on the inside, tools on the inside, and put those distressing factors on the outside. And I think that visual can help. That's one taste of some of the ways in which we're using the strengths-based approach to help develop treatment plans and interventions for individuals who are suicidal. Coming soon, Rita and I and our research team are working on a happiness potential questionnaire for students so that we can evaluate collaboratively with them how they're doing in these 7 dimensions. And so if they have a low happiness potential, we might say to them, well, hey, you've got a low, you've got a lot of potential. You've got a lot of potential here. And so but in addition to a traditional suicide screening process, which can be pretty depressing and panicky for everyone, we also want to add this more positive screening process. And so we're working on it. Number of strengths-based resources that you could use that are related to the work that I'm doing and that Rita and I are doing. I have a blog that has free stuff. You could be an email follower on my blog or just check it out once in a while. I've got a 7.5-hour training video with psychotherapy.net. At 7.5 hours is kind of long, but that's what the clip from Kennedy from this workshop, was from. We also have a book with the American Counseling Association on strengths-based suicide assessment and treatment. You can find that online. And then we have established the Montana Happiness Project, and we have a website, and you can go on there for resources as well. And that's one of the places that I will post this 1 and 5 minute long video training. All right, so I am done talking. I've talked fast and a lot. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me via email or other methods. I want to end by saying thank you so much for being the kind of person who would spend an hour learning about this topic. I believe you are a gift to the young people or the older people with whom you're working, and I am hopeful and I am happy that you are doing the important work that you're doing. So thanks for listening. I am now going to stop the recording.